A whirlwind romance that lasted months. A man who thought he had found his perfect match. But behind the filtered photos and carefully crafted lies lay a devastating truth that would shatter everything he believed about love, trust, and the woman sleeping beside him each night. Chapter 1. The Golden Boy's Empire. Adrian Hayes commanded respect the moment he stepped into any room in Miami. At 35, he possessed that rare combination of raw ambition and polished success that made people pause their conversations just to watch him move. His tailored suits fit like armor. His handshake felt like a promise. And when he spoke, even the most powerful developers in South Beach leaned forward to listen. But Adrian hadn't been born into this world of marble lobbies and million-dollar deals. 20 years earlier, he was just another kid from Hialeah with calloused hands and concrete dust under his fingernails, swinging a hammer on construction sites before sunrise. His mother, Carmen, had raised him alone after his father disappeared when Adrian was 12, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises. Carmen worked 3 jobs to keep their small apartment, cleaning offices at night, serving breakfast at a diner before dawn, and taking in sewing during whatever hours remained. Those early years carved something unbreakable into Adrian's soul. While other teenagers spent summers at the beach, he spent them learning the weight of responsibility, watching his mother's exhaustion deepen with each passing month. The sight of her counting coins for groceries became the fuel that drove every decision he would make for the rest of his life. His first break came at 19 when a foreman noticed Adrian stayed late without being asked, studying blueprints while other workers headed home. That foreman, a weathered Cuban immigrant named Roberto, saw potential beneath the young man's hunger. Roberto taught Adrian to read the language of construction, to understand not just how buildings were made, but why they succeeded or failed. More importantly, he taught Adrian that in Miami's booming real estate market, the real money wasn't in swinging hammers. It was in owning the projects. By 25, Adrian had saved enough to purchase his first property, a rundown duplex in Little Havana that nobody else wanted. He renovated it himself, working nights and weekends, transforming decay into desirability. When he sold it 6 months later for double his investment, he knew he had found his calling. The profit became the seed money for his next project, then the next, each success building momentum like a rolling stone gathering mass. Hayes Properties emerged from those humble beginnings, growing from a one-man operation into one of Miami's most respected development firms. By his 35th birthday, Adrian owned a portfolio worth 8 figures, with projects spanning from downtown high-rises to luxury waterfront condominiums. His business cards carried weight in boardrooms across the city, and his name appeared regularly in real estate publications as one of the industry's rising stars. Success, however, had demanded sacrifices. While his contemporaries were getting married and starting families, Adrian had been consumed by the intoxicating challenge of building his empire. Relationships came and went, casualties of his relentless focus and the demanding schedule that kept him traveling between construction sites and investor meetings. Women were attracted to his success, but few understood the drive that created it, and fewer still were willing to compete with his ambition for his attention. Now, standing at the pinnacle of everything he had worked to achieve, Adrian found himself facing a different kind of emptiness. The luxury penthouse overlooking Biscayne Bay felt hollow despite its expensive furnishings. The sports cars in his garage provided thrills that lasted only as long as the drive. The accolades and magazine features couldn't fill the silence that greeted him each evening when he returned home alone. Adrian had conquered Miami's real estate market, but he was beginning to realize that success without someone to share it with felt surprisingly incomplete. Chapter 2. The Master of Reinvention. Valentina Santos had become an expert at erasing herself. At 40 years old, she possessed the kind of survival skills that only come from decades of disappointment, heartbreak, and the relentless pursuit of something better than the life she had been living. Every morning, she stood before her bathroom mirror in her cramped Tampa apartment, studying her reflection like a sculptor examining marble, searching for the woman she needed to become that day. The truth of Valentina's existence was scattered across 2 decades and 7 children, each one a reminder of a relationship that had promised forever but delivered abandonment instead. Her eldest, Miguel, was now 19, the product of her first love affair with a charming mechanic who disappeared the moment pregnancy became reality rather than possibility. Her youngest, Sophia, had just turned 3, born from a relationship with a restaurant manager who decided fatherhood wasn't compatible with his career ambitions. Between them were 5 other children, each bearing the surnames of men who had sworn devotion before vanishing into the comfortable distance that irresponsible men create when accountability arrives. There was Carmen from a construction worker who chose cocaine over commitment. There was Diego from the truck driver, who simply never returned for what he claimed was a temporary route. There was Esperanza from the church youth pastor, who transferred to another state when his congregation learned about his secret family. The pattern had become so predictable that Valentina sometimes wondered if she attracted broken promises the way magnets attract metal. Her small apartment reflected the chaos of raising 7 children on inconsistent child support and whatever work she could find. Toys were scattered across floors that needed replacing. Clothes hung on lines stretched between rooms, and the constant soundtrack of sibling arguments, homework struggles, and television programs competing for volume. The older children had learned to help with the younger ones, creating a hierarchy of responsibility that broke Valentina's heart even as it kept her household functioning. But somewhere between the 3rd child support hearing and the 5th restraining order, Valentina had discovered something powerful about herself. She was remarkably skilled at becoming whoever the moment required. In court, she transformed into the dignified, single mother deserving of justice. At job interviews, she became a reliable candidate with flexible availability. With men, she could become anything they needed her to be, at least temporarily. The digital age had given Valentina tools that previous generations of desperate women could never have imagined. Photo editing applications could subtract 20 pounds and 15 years with a few strategic adjustments. Dating profiles allowed her to craft entirely fictional biographies, free from the complications of 7 children and 2 decades of romantic disasters. Social media became her laboratory for experimentation, a place where she could test different versions of herself to see which ones attracted the kind of attention she craved. Instagram became her masterpiece. Under carefully curated lighting and strategic camera angles, Valentina Santos, the overwhelmed mother of Seve, disappeared entirely. In her place emerged Val, a vibrant 23-year-old with an infectious smile and an apparently carefree existence filled with beach trips, restaurant dinners, and shopping excursions that existed only in the carefully staged photographs she posted. The transformation required meticulous planning. She arranged childcare through her sister, Rosa, whenever she needed to maintain the illusion during video calls or in-person meetings. She memorized a completely fabricated personal history, complete with fake college experiences, imaginary career achievements, and fictional family dynamics that painted her as an only child from a middle-class background. Every filtered selfie was a small act of rebellion against the reality that had trapped her. Every flirtatious conversation with a man who believed she was decades younger felt like a victory against the cruelty of time and circumstance. Valentina had become addicted to the intoxicating possibility that somewhere in the digital landscape of dating applications and social media connections, she might finally find the man wealthy enough and naive enough to rescue her from the life she had accidentally built. The plan had worked before, though never completely. She had managed short-term relationships with men who believed her carefully constructed lies, but eventually, reality always intruded. Children got sick and needed their mother. School events required attendance. The logistics of maintaining 7 separate lives while pretending to have none eventually became impossible to manage. But Adrian Hayes represented something different, something bigger, something that might finally be worth the risk of complete deception. Chapter 3: When Worlds Collide. The Fontainebleau Miami beach gleamed under the October evening sky, its Art Deco curves illuminated by spotlights that transformed the iconic hotel into a beacon of luxury and exclusivity. Inside the Grand Ballroom, Miami's elite gathered for the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala, an event where million-dollar donations were announced between courses of imported caviar and vintage champagne. The guest list read like a directory of South Florida's most influential figures, and among them, Adrian Hayes moved with the comfortable confidence of a man who belonged in such rarefied air. Valentina Santos had spent 3 months preparing for this single evening. Through careful research and strategic social media investigation, she had learned that Adrian would be attending as a platinum sponsor, his company having donated a significant sum to the hospital's new pediatric wing. She had purchased her ticket using money scraped together from 3 months of extra shifts at the dental office where she worked as a receptionist, telling herself this investment would change everything. Her transformation that evening was nothing short of masterful. The black cocktail dress hugged her figure in ways that suggested youth and vitality, while professional makeup artfully concealed the small lines that whispered of her true age. Her hair fell in cascading waves that caught the ballroom's crystal chandelier light, and her smile carried the kind of brightness that made people forget to ask complicated questions about her past. She had arrived early, positioning herself strategically near the silent auction tables where she knew Adrian would eventually venture. Valentina had studied his patterns through his social media presence and business interviews, learning that he was drawn to art and often made significant purchases at charity events. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched him enter the ballroom, his presence commanding attention even among a room full of successful individuals. Adrian wore his success like a second skin, moving through conversations with the ease of someone accustomed to being sought after rather than seeking. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, and when he laughed at something a business associate said, the sound carried genuine warmth that distinguished him from the polished but hollow charm that characterized so many wealthy men. The moment Valentina had rehearsed finally arrived. As Adrian approached the auction display featuring a series of contemporary paintings, she positioned herself to examine the same artwork, her timing appearing perfectly coincidental. When he reached for the bid sheet on a vibrant abstract piece, she simultaneously reached for the same paper, their hands brushing in a contact that sent electricity through her carefully controlled composure. Their eyes met, and Valentina deployed the smile she had practiced in her bathroom mirror dozens of times. It was warm but not desperate, interested but not overly eager, the kind of expression that suggested pleasant surprise rather than calculated intent. Adrian's response exceeded her most optimistic expectations. His own smile appeared genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that suggested he was genuinely intrigued rather than merely polite. Their conversation began with the safe territory of art appreciation, but within minutes, they had discovered a seemingly natural rhythm that made interaction feel effortless. Valentina had memorized enough cultural references and business terminology to hold her own in discussions about Miami's development boom and the city's evolving artistic landscape. She laughed at his observations with timing that felt spontaneous, asked questions that demonstrated intelligence without threatening his expertise, and managed to convey interest in him as a person rather than fascination with his wealth. Adrian found himself drawn to this mysterious woman who seemed refreshingly different from the usual charity circuit regulars. She possessed a vibrancy that felt authentic, a quality that had become increasingly rare in his social circles, where most interactions carried underlying agendas. When she introduced herself simply as Val, offering no last name or elaborate personal history, he interpreted her discretion as confidence rather than concealment. The chemistry between them was undeniable, crackling with the kind of electric tension that makes time seem suspended. Chapter 4. Love in the Fast Lane. The months following their chance encounter transformed into a whirlwind romance that consumed both Adrian Hayes and the woman he knew only as Val. Their relationship developed with an intensity that surprised even Adrian, who had grown accustomed to the calculated pace of business negotiations and carefully measured social interactions. With Val, everything felt spontaneous, electric, and remarkably effortless. Their dates became the highlight of Adrian's increasingly busy schedule. Weekend trips to Key West, where they walked barefoot along private beaches, intimate dinners at South Beach restaurants where conversation flowed like expensive wine, and cultural events where Val demonstrated an impressive knowledge of art and architecture that complemented his own interests perfectly. She possessed an uncanny ability to match his energy while maintaining an air of mystery that kept him perpetually intrigued. What Adrian didn't recognize was the masterful orchestration behind every seemingly casual moment. Valentina had transformed herself into a full-time performance artist, with Adrian as her unwitting audience. Every outfit was carefully selected to maintain the illusion of youth and freedom. Every restaurant suggestion came from extensive research into places where she was unlikely to encounter anyone from her real life. Every weekend getaway required elaborate arrangements with her sister, Rosa, to manage the 7 children whose existence Adrian never suspected. The logistics of maintaining her double life had become exhaustingly complex. Valentina's phone contained 2 separate contact lists, 2 email accounts, and multiple social media profiles that required constant monitoring to prevent any crossover between her fantasy existence and her actual responsibilities. She had become an expert at manufacturing explanations for her occasional unavailability, crafting stories about work obligations and family commitments that sounded plausible without providing specific details that could later be verified. Adrian's friends, however, were not as easily deceived as Adrian himself. During poker nights and business dinners, his closest associates began expressing subtle concerns about the relationship's rapid progression and Val's apparent reluctance to integrate into his established social circles. His business partner, James, was the most direct in his observations. The conversations always followed similar patterns. James would mention how little they actually knew about this woman who had captured Adrian's complete attention. Others would note that despite months of dating, none of them had met her friends or family, learned about her background, or even discovered her last name. The warnings were delivered with the careful diplomacy that successful men use when questioning each other's judgment, but the underlying message was unmistakably clear. Adrian dismissed these concerns with the confidence of a man who believed he had finally found something genuine in a world full of artificial connections. He interpreted Val's privacy as refreshing discretion rather than suspicious secrecy. Her reluctance to discuss her past seemed like wisdom rather than deception. The fact that she never asked about his wealth or made demands for expensive gifts convinced him that her feelings were authentic rather than calculated. Valentina's skill at deflecting personal inquiries had reached professional levels. When Adrian asked about her family, she would smile wistfully and change the subject to his own childhood, demonstrating such genuine interest in his experiences that he forgot his original question. When he suggested meeting her friends, she would laugh and claim they were all boring compared to the fascinating people in his circles. Her evasions felt like modesty rather than manipulation. By their 6-month anniversary, Adrian was completely convinced that he had discovered his soulmate. The engagement ring he selected was a testament to both his success and his certainty, a stunning diamond solitaire that represented everything he hoped their future would become. When he proposed on the rooftop of his penthouse, with Miami's skyline glittering beneath them like scattered diamonds, Valentina's tears were genuine for perhaps the first time in their entire relationship. Chapter 5. Cracks in Paradise. The wedding ceremony unfolded like a dream Adrian had never dared to imagine. On a pristine Saturday morning in March, beneath swaying palm trees at a luxury resort in Coral Gables, he watched Valentina glide down the petal-strewn aisle in a flowing white gown that transformed her into something ethereal. The intimate gathering of 50 guests witnessed what appeared to be the perfect union between Miami's most eligible bachelor and the mysterious woman who had captured his heart so completely. Valentina had insisted on keeping the celebration small and elegant, a decision Adrian interpreted as sophisticated restraint rather than strategic limitation. She claimed her family lived too far away to attend, painting vague pictures of relatives in California who couldn't make the journey. Her friends, she explained with convincing regret, were either traveling or dealing with their own personal crises that prevented their participation. Adrian accepted these explanations without question, too intoxicated by happiness to recognize the careful architecture of her deceptions. The honeymoon in the Bahamas passed in a haze of crystalline waters, private dinners, and the kind of passionate intimacy that convinced Adrian he had found his perfect match. Valentina was attentive, affectionate, and seemingly as blissfully happy as he felt. When they returned to Miami and began settling in a married life in his penthouse, Adrian believed he was living the beginning of his greatest success story. But perfection, Adrian would soon learn, is difficult to maintain under the scrutiny of daily life. The first inconsistencies emerged as tiny fractures that he initially dismissed as unimportant details. Valentina would mention a childhood memory that contradicted something she had said months earlier. Her knowledge of current events seemed oddly focused on topics that someone her supposed age might not prioritize. Her taste in music and movies skewed toward preferences that seemed more aligned with someone who had lived through different decades than she claimed. More troubling were the phone calls that would send her into private corners of the penthouse, speaking in hushed tones that carried an urgency Adrian couldn't understand. When he asked about these conversations, Valentina would smile and claim they involved work situations or friend dramas that weren't worth discussing. Her explanations felt rehearsed, delivered with the kind of casual precision that suggested careful preparation rather than spontaneous honesty. 3 weeks into their marriage, Adrian's business instincts began overriding his romantic optimism. During a routine meeting with his accountant, he casually mentioned wanting to add Valentina to various insurance policies and investment accounts. The process required her social security number and full legal name, information that his wife had somehow never provided despite months of intimacy and weeks of marriage. When Adrian requested these details that evening, Valentina's reaction struck him as oddly evasive. She claimed her social security card was in storage and promised to retrieve it later. She provided a full name that sounded formal and unfamiliar, nothing like the casual Val she had always used. Her discomfort was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to read people's reactions during high-stakes business negotiations. By the end of their first month of marriage, Adrian made a decision that would shatter everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the woman sharing his bed each night. He contacted a private investigation firm that specialized in background verification and asset protection for high-net-worth individuals. The conversation felt like a betrayal of everything marriage was supposed to represent, but his mounting suspicions had created an anxiety that made peaceful sleep impossible. The investigator, a former police detective named Catherine Walsh, assured Adrian that such requests were more common than he might imagine. Wealthy individuals frequently discovered that people had approached them with fabricated identities and manufactured histories. Her tone was professional and non-judgmental, treating Adrian's concerns as legitimate business rather than marital paranoia. Within 72 hours, Catherine Walsh called Adrian with preliminary findings that made his blood run cold. The woman he had married was not 23 years old. Her real name was Valentina Santos, not the Val Martinez she had claimed to be. Most devastating of all, she was the mother of 7 children by 6 different men, with a documented history that painted a picture of systematic deception that extended far beyond their relationship. Chapter 6: When Truth Becomes Destruction. The confrontation erupted on a Thursday evening when Adrian could no longer carry the weight of what he had discovered. He returned home early from the office, carrying Catherine Walsh's complete investigative report in a manila folder that felt heavier than any business contract he had ever signed. The documents contained birth certificates, school records, court filings, and photographs that created an undeniable portrait of the woman he thought he had married. Valentina was in their bedroom, applying makeup before what she claimed was a dinner with college friends. Adrian watched her through the doorway, studying her face with the detached fascination of someone examining evidence in a criminal case. Every smile line, every gesture, Every word took on new meaning now that he understood the magnitude of her deception. When he spread the documents across their bed, Valentina's carefully constructed world began collapsing in real time. Her face cycled through expressions of shock, panic, calculation, and finally a kind of desperate defiance that suggested she had always known this moment would eventually arrive. The argument began with Adrian's voice barely above a whisper, his words carrying the crushing weight of complete betrayal. He asked questions that demanded impossible answers. How could she lie about having 7 children? How could she fabricate an entire identity? How could she look him in the eyes every morning and continue the deception that had become their marriage? Valentina's initial response was to maintain her fiction, claiming the documents were forged, suggesting that someone was trying to destroy their happiness. But faced with birth certificates, school records, and legal documents that created an undeniable paper trail of her actual existence, her denials crumbled into desperate justifications. Her voice rose as she tried to explain the impossible complexity of her situation. She spoke about the crushing burden of raising 7 children alone, about the men who had abandoned her repeatedly, about the hopelessness that had driven her to create a new identity as her only path to survival. She described years of poverty, the constant struggle to provide for her children, and the growing desperation that had convinced her that deception was her only viable escape route. Adrian listened to her explanations with the mounting fury of a man discovering that everything he believed about his life was constructed from lies. Her justifications felt like additional insults, attempts to make him complicit in his own victimization. The woman he had fallen in love with had never existed. The future he had envisioned was built on foundations that were now collapsing beneath the weight of truth. The argument escalated with the momentum of an avalanche, consuming their penthouse with voices that transformed their luxury home into an arena of mutual destruction. Valentina followed Adrian from room to room, her desperation manifesting as aggressive defiance. She accused him of being naive, of creating impossible standards that no real woman could meet, of falling in love with a fantasy that she had simply provided. The physical confrontation began when Valentina, driven by the terror of losing everything she had fought so desperately to achieve, grabbed Adrian's arm as he tried to walk away from her desperate pleas. Her grip was tight, fueled by panic, and when Adrian reflexively pulled away, the sudden movement sent her stumbling backward toward their bedroom's marble-topped nightstand. The impact happened with the kind of sickening finality that transforms arguments into tragedies. Valentina's head struck the sharp corner of the marble surface with a sound that would haunt Adrian for the rest of his life. She collapsed instantly, her body crumpling to the floor as blood began pooling beneath her head in an expanding circle that reflected the overhead lighting. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Adrian's labored breathing and the distant sound of Miami traffic continuing its oblivious patterns far below their penthouse windows. Chapter 7. The Price of Deception. The emergency call that Adrian Hayes placed at 11:47 that Thursday evening would be replayed countless times during the legal proceedings that followed. His voice, captured forever on the 911 recording, carried the kind of raw terror that investigators recognize as genuine shock rather than calculated performance. Between gasps and barely coherent sentences, he described the accident, begged for paramedics, and repeated variations of the same desperate phrase. "I didn't mean for this to happen." The Miami-Dade police arrived within minutes, followed closely by paramedics who confirmed what Adrian already knew with devastating certainty. Valentina Santos had died from a traumatic head injury, her elaborate deception ending in the same penthouse where she had hoped to build her new life. The crime scene investigators photographed everything with clinical precision. The overturned furniture, the blood staining the marble surface, the scattered documents that had triggered the confrontation, and Adrian himself, sitting motionless in the living room with his head buried in his hands. The arrest came at dawn. Adrian was charged with voluntary manslaughter, a decision that reflected the prosecutor's belief that while he hadn't planned Valentina's death, his actions during their argument had directly caused her fatal injury. The media coverage was immediate and relentless, transforming their tragic story into headline entertainment for a city that thrived on scandal involving the wealthy and prominent. During the 18 months between arrest and trial, the full scope of Valentina's deception became public knowledge. Investigative journalists uncovered the intricate web of lies she had constructed, painting detailed portraits of her 7 children who had suddenly found themselves not only motherless but thrust into the spotlight of unwanted notoriety. Her eldest son, Miguel, now 20 years old, became the family spokesperson, speaking to reporters with the weary dignity of someone forced to mature beyond his years. The children had been living with Valentina's sister, Rosa, during the months when their mother was playing the role of Adrian's young bride. Rosa testified during the trial about the financial arrangements Valentina had made, the elaborate schedules she maintained to keep her 2 lives separate, and the increasing desperation that had driven her sister to more extreme measures of deception. Adrian's trial began on a sweltering August morning, with courthouse steps lined with cameras and spectators drawn by the salacious details that had dominated local news cycles for months. The prosecution painted him as a privileged man whose ego couldn't handle being outmaneuvered by a woman whose survival had depended on her ability to manipulate wealthy targets. They presented evidence of his considerable assets, suggesting that his anger stemmed from wounded pride rather than genuine heartbreak. The defense team countered with a different narrative, one that portrayed Adrian as the victim of an elaborate confidence scheme that had destroyed his ability to trust his own judgment. They brought in psychological experts who testified about the trauma associated with discovering that one's entire relationship had been built on systematic deception. Character witnesses described Adrian's previously unblemished reputation and his history of charitable contributions to organizations that helped underprivileged children. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching its verdict. They found Adrian guilty of voluntary manslaughter, but recommended the minimum sentence allowable under state law. The judge, acknowledging the complexity of the circumstances while emphasizing that deception does not justify violence, sentenced Adrian to 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 8 years. The courtroom was silent as Adrian rose to hear his fate, his legal team having prepared him for this outcome. In the gallery, members of both families sat in separate sections, representing the dual tragedy that had emerged from Valentina's desperate gamble for a better life. Her children would grow up without their mother, while Adrian would spend nearly a decade behind bars, his business empire managed by trustees and his reputation permanently stained by the events of that Thursday evening. In his final statement before sentencing, Adrian addressed Valentina's children directly, offering condolences that felt both genuine and inadequate. He spoke about his own regret, not just for the tragic outcome, but for failing to see beyond his own desires to recognize the desperation that had driven their mother to such extreme measures of deception. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangerous intersection of desperation and deception, studied in law schools and referenced in discussions about domestic violence and economic inequality. Both Adrian and Valentina had paid the ultimate price for choices that seemed rational within their respective circumstances, but proved catastrophic when those worlds collided. Years later, when legal scholars analyzed the case, they would note that it represented something darker than simple romantic deception. It illustrated how economic desperation could drive people to increasingly dangerous choices, and how privilege could create blind spots that made even intelligent, successful individuals vulnerable to manipulation they never imagined possible. The 7 children grew up carrying their mother's story, forever marked by both her desperation and her tragic end, while Adrian Hayes learned that some mistakes create consequences that no amount of success or regret can ever truly repair. What did you think of this twisted tale of deception and desperation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and hit subscribe for more stories that expose the dangerous secrets people hide behind perfect facades.